Well, I see some new faces. It's welcome. If you're just joining us, we are in a class. It's turning into a long class, but a class on a theology of the Bible's take on government and politics. And we thought we would do this during an election year because why not, right? So. We moved through the Old Testament and tried to look at most of the relevant passages that we could find. And now we're moving through the New Testament, looking at New Testament passages that bear upon human government, human politics. And we are in the Gospels. And you can't say as a pastor that you have a favorite passage, but because it's all God's word, right? But if I could only choose one or two passages in the New Testament related to God and government and politics, this would be at the very top of the list. This passage is so, it's an astonishing passage, and it is crammed, packed, full of political implications, and it's just a remarkable passage. So I just want to open again with another passage that sometimes we just read over quickly and miss the political implications. This is from the first chapter of Luke, and the angel has come to Mary to tell her that she's going to bear a son named Jesus. And this is what the angel tells Mary. He will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High. Look at all the political phrases, the political terms in this passage. He will be great. He will be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. And so we're moving on to the trial of Jesus before Pilate, the crucifixion of Jesus. And Pilate, we looked at last week, as a Roman governor. He's a military governor. He's not Israel was under occupation, a military occupation of Rome. And so Pilate is trained as a military officer. And at the heart of this passage lies the question, if Jesus is king, what is he king of? What is his kingdom like? What's the nature of his kingdom? And what does that have to do with human kingdoms and earthly kingdoms? And this passage is full of profound thoughts on that. So we're going to pick up in John chapter 18. This is actually a long narrative. We're just going to pick up the trial scene, Jesus before Pilate. So starting in the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 33. And we'll just read the text here. I'll read it out loud, beginning in verse 33. So Pilate entered his headquarters, his military headquarters, and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This scene is just bristling with contempt, and Pilate despises the Jews. The feeling is mutual. The Jews despise Pilate. These are two groups of people that are kind of stuck together, but they hate each other. And the language of this interaction is just seething with contempt and animosity. And you'll see, if you hear it read with the right emphasis, you can hear it come through. Are you the king of the Jews? It's not a serious question, right? It's a question of contempt, right? And Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. but my kingdom is not from the world." And Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" So this whole scene is set up because the Jewish religious leaders are really in a fix. They want to kill Jesus, but they don't have the authority to execute him, right? Because they're not politically in charge. Why do they want to kill Jesus?
He's upsetting the apple cart, the way things are.
Right. Yeah, he's potentially, well, he's telling them that they don't know what they're doing, right? They're in charge. At least they have a certain measure of autonomy under Rome to do their stuff. And in that system, they have a pretty good place, right? And so that's getting upset. But theologically, what's their big beef with Jesus?
He claims to be God.
He claims to be God. It's blasphemy, right? The main reason they want to kill him is because they believe he's committing blasphemy by claiming to be God, right? So it's theological reasons. Does Pilate care about the Jews' theological squabbles? Not at all, right? And so, yeah, they want to kill him because of his claim to be the Messiah and to be God. Pilate doesn't give a fig for that stuff, right? All he cares about is one thing, right? He has one job. What's Pilate's one job?
Rule peace.
Yeah, to rule, to keep the peace, to keep order, to keep revolts from springing up in Israel, right? That's his job, is to keep the population in check. It's a population that hates him, that hates the rule, but his job is to keep them under their thumb, right? And so if they're going to have Jesus executed, they're going to have to frame it before Pilate in political terms, the terms that Pilate understands, right? And so what do they emphasize? What do the Jewish religious leaders emphasize in this trial before Pilate? Do they emphasize that Jesus claimed to be God, that he's the... No, what do they emphasize? Yeah, that he wants to overthrow Rome, right? And so what's the irony in that situation? They really want to overthrow Rome too, but they're not allowed to say that. They just say, this guy wants to overthrow Rome, even though they'd be, although there's probably lots of them who maybe theologically they'd love to see Rome overthrown, but if it meant them losing their own personal power, maybe they're okay leaving things as they are, right? And so this passage is just full of irony. But what the Jewish leaders emphasize is the Old Testament prophecies that foretell the Messiah as the son of David, who's David, right, who threw off the bad guys, who's this military leader who's going to deliver the people from bondage, right? And so this passage is just so full of irony. So when Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you the king?" and it's not, I don't believe it's a serious question. I think it's a question loaded with contempt. But how should Jesus answer that question? I mean, if it's not even an honest question, right? Jesus asks Pilate a question back, throws another question back at him. Why? He has to know, what are you actually asking when you're asking me this question, right? Because when Pilate asks, is Jesus the king? Yes, the short answer, and the long answer is also yes, right? Jesus is the king. He's king over everything. But how should he reply to Pilate in this situation? Right? In the Jewish expectation, and they're not wrong, the Messiah who comes in the line of David is destined to be the deliverer king of Israel. And they're not wrong about that, right? So the whole Old Testament points to a coming deliverer king who is going to free the captives, who's going to restore justice and righteousness. He's going to vindicate God's people before the nations, right? So Jesus, how he answers this is really crucial because he is the king. But what kind of a king is he? What's the nature of his kingdom? This is really the nub of the question in his trial before Pilate. Does that make sense? Thoughts on this?
It's just interesting to see how it all plays out. And Jesus is, he understands there's always a question behind the question.
Right.
And he lets, Pilate just come to his own conclusion.
Right. I read a statistic this last year. The percentage of times that when Jesus comes and gets asked a question, the percentage of times he actually just answers it is really low. He usually throws back a question to try to get behind. There's always assumptions behind the question, right? He almost always turns it back around to try to surface the intentions of the person's heart who's asking the questions, right? And he's doing that clearly here with Pilate as well. Right? So this is Jesus' reply. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. What does Jesus mean by saying that? I mean, it's
my kingdom is not of this world, therefore my servants have not been fighting.
right. He says almost.
I am willing to be delivered over to the Jews. So
Right. Yeah, he says almost exactly that. And we have a scene just a few hours earlier, actually the previous evening, right? The night before, where Peter, one of his followers, does actually pull out a sword and is very willing to fight the men coming to take Jesus. And this is all four Gospels record this, but Matthew maybe gives the most detail. So here's the account from Matthew. One of those who were with Jesus, we know this to be Peter, he drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, to Peter, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" So what's Jesus trying to communicate to Peter? It's not for lack of power, right? Jesus doesn't lack power. It's how he's choosing to exercise it or not exercise that power, right? And why, I think this is a question maybe we don't think about very much, but why does Jesus, during his time on earth, choose not to exercise military power? One day he is going to, right? That is going to happen. Why does he choose not to do that during his first coming?
He's laying his life down willingly.
Right. He's willingly laying it down. And I would argue he's laying out a model for his servants, right? For his 12 disciples and for all of us who also live in this same age. He's laying out a model for how evil is to be defeated. And it's not primarily by the sword, right? Someone says that in this age, the kingdom of God does not advance by the sword. That's been tried. There's been, in church history, there's been people who tried to convert people at the point of the sword. The religion of Islam explicitly teaches that you convert people at sword point, right? That's not a problem in Islam, right? Jesus says that's not going to be how my kingdom operates during this age, right? Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. This is just packed full of implications. We have to figure out, what does this mean? Right? What does it mean for us? There's in this verse, the preposition of, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. My kingdom is not from the world. So this preposition of and from is doing a lot of work. What does that mean when he says, my kingdom is not from this world? Does it mean that it has no implications for this world? That has no effect in this world?
This title doesn't come from the world system.
Yeah, the preposition in Greek that translates into English as from or of is for you English geeks out there, it's a preposition. The Greek word is entuthen, and it means not originating from this location, right? So that's true. Jesus' kingdom does not originate from this location, right? But is his kingdom for this world? Is it for the redemption of this world? It is, right? It's not strictly an otherworldly reality. So Romans 8 says this creation, right, the one in which we live, waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we await eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. It makes me think of Zeke's closing illustration of Hitler, right? We're living in that space between when the Allies landed on Normandy and basically sealed Hitler's fate, but he's still alive in Berlin in a bunker, and he hasn't surrendered yet, right? That's the age in which we live, right? And it's an age of groaning because we're still living with the effects of sin. I like to think of it as that the head has been cut off the snake, but the body's still thrashing around doing an awful lot of damage, right? It's still real. It's still a real threat, even though the head has been cut off the snake, right?
Could you say it like this, that Jesus didn't want to use his power to rule as a government like Rome to bring his grace?
Mm-hmm.
What would that look like?
Right.
To have the power of the government like Rome
Right.
to force like the Romans to
Mhm.
believe his grace. So
He-
it don't even,
He could have done that.
Yeah.
He would have been right in doing that, right? He would be justified in, if he chose to do that. That's what actually people expected,
yeah,
right? Is one coming and one final day of judgment, the day of the Lord, right?
I think they still would have, Jewish leaders still would have had conflict with that.
Oh,
Because
sure. Yeah,
That
yeah,
was the setting because they looked
Yeah.
at themselves as being pure and good,
yeah,
upholding the law.
yeah. There's a chapter in, I think it's in the book of Micah in the Old Testament, where the prophet is saying, you are anticipating the day of the Lord. Because you're like, don't get excited about the day of the Lord, because it ain't going to be good for you either, right? Because you're not right with God. Their thinking is, we have oppressors over us, so we want the day of the Lord to come and smash those oppressors. He's like, yeah, that day ain't going to go good for you either, right? Because you're not right with me either. Right?
Well, that's exactly the reason that he didn't do that, is because he wants to be merciful to us. But because he's just, unless the sin is dealt with and paid for,
Right.
he can't be merciful to us.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Justice would not go well for any of us. Just pure justice, right?
So had he exerted his kingdom over the world without making the sacrifice for our sins, we'd be in big trouble.
It'd be a kingdom with no people in it. Right? It would be Noah and right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So when Jesus says, "My kingdom does not originate from this world," what he does not mean is it has nothing to do with this world. So I used this illustration before, but my wife Sandy is from Pennsylvania. She's not from Nebraska. She was not born in our house. That doesn't mean she doesn't care about our house. No, because obviously she cares a great deal about what happens in our house, even though she wasn't born there, right? And Jesus came from God, but he came to save the world, right? Is Jesus saying that he has no interest, no concern in what takes place in this world? No, he's saying that his origin lies beyond the small contours of this world. Does that make sense? I think that's the most faithful way to interpret his statement there. But feel free. Is there anything else, or feel free to push back if this doesn't seem off somehow.
Does it seem that Jesus is trying to tell Pilate that he isn't there for violent revolution too? That almost like a witnessing opportunity to Pilate that
Yeah.
this is about more than what the Jews are saying, and it seems like Pilate's picking up on that the way he responds or keeps asking questions.
I would guess Pilate is genuinely puzzled, like, who is this dude that people are so worked up about, right? And because he just looks like he's somebody walking around wearing sandals. He's not tattooed up and wearing a sword, and right? He looks like a hippie, probably not, but he doesn't look like a threat. He's already been beaten up by religious people. Like, you're the king, you're a threat, really? And again, he's thinking in Roman terms, which are the only terms he knows to think in, right? But he has to be, like, at least curious. Like, why do they want to kill you so bad? What did you actually do, right?
There had to be some thought in Pilate's mind that this is just a crazy dude.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
claiming that you're not from
Right.
this world.
Right.
I mean, if someone came to us, we'd be like, yeah.
Right. And these guys have come and gone. There were revolts shortly after Jesus was born, there was a major revolt led by a peasant. When Jesus was about 10 years old, there was another major revolt led by a peasant. There were people running around claiming to be the Messiah, trying to overthrow Rome, and none of them lasted for more than a couple of weeks, right? So Pilate's seen these guys come and go, and yeah, again, the contempt you see in the way that he, but Jesus turns it on him. Jesus is putting Pilate in the dock in a sense, right?
Pilate knows he's not like those other guys.
Right. He's not sitting there trembling.
Obviously brilliant. Yeah.
Right. He knows, he has to realize he's dealing with something different than what he normally deals with, right? Yeah. Okay, so again, this world is not just a meaningless throwaway thing. God sacrificed everything for the redemption of this world, right? God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jesus absolutely expects that his kingdom will have a permanent, revolutionary impact on this actual world in which we live, right? So when Pilate asks, "Are you a king?" I would say Jesus can't simply give a yes or a no. He's trying to surface what's going on in Pilate's heart, and if Jesus were the king in the sense that Pilate is thinking of, then yes, he would have mustered up his followers to take up swords, right, and to fight physically against Rome. Peter actually tried that on his own, right? The kingdoms of this world, kingdoms like Rome, kingdoms that still exist today, they keep their grip on power through violence and fear and force, right? And Jesus says, my kingdom doesn't operate like that. That's not how I exercise my power. So now we're going to jump forward to John chapter 19 now, picking up in verse 9. So he, that is Pilate, entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate is miffed that Jesus has the moxie to not answer him, right? He says, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know I have the authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" This is astonishing. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above." Like nobody ever talks to Pilate. No condemned criminal talks to Pilate that way, right? Pilate says, "Yeah, you should tremble and be afraid. You should answer me when I speak to you, because I have the power to crush you right here in my hand," right? And Jesus says, actually, you would have no power at all if it wasn't given to you, right? And by above, he doesn't mean Caesar, right? But there's also, in this statement that Jesus gives, there's huge political implications for earthly politics in that statement, right? What are the political implications for us now that you would have no authority unless it had been given you? Right, what does it have to do with modern politics or all politics from 2,000 years ago up into the present?
Politics aside, could we, as individuals, make that statement regardless? We would be talking to you, have no authority over me unless it was given to you.
Right. There seems to be an authorizing of human government in the sense that, and we'll get this later in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, where Paul and Peter, who both eventually got executed by Rome, both said, the authority set up over us, it's our job to, as much as possible, live peaceably underneath that, right? Because all authority is set up by God, right? So it's not. You might draw the conclusion, if Jesus is king and Caesar is not king over all reality, then why not have anarchy, right? Why have human governments if Jesus is the only king? Why have any government except the government of God? That might be an obvious conclusion you would draw if the Bible didn't regularly say in the New Testament that there is, in some sense that we can't fully understand, God has authorized in this meantime, in between time period, God has authorized human governments to have real authority. It doesn't mean that they exercise it perfectly. In fact, Rome was far from something any of us would be comfortable living under, right? There's a how do we think about this?
I think it's in Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar is called. God is saying, "My servant Nebuchadnezzar is going to crush you because of this sin."
Yeah.
My servant, and then he talks
Later,
about
Cyrus, and same thing with Cyrus later in Persia. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing that's said is that we get the government we deserve as human beings. Usually, I think that's often true.
But it is also true that not everybody gets the government.
Right. There are good God-fearing believers in North Korea who don't deserve to be ruled by the government that they're ruled by, right?
It'd almost be easier to fall into that statement if you had no control, like if you were living in North Korea. And you as an individual really had no control.
Right.
In America, where there is a voting process, you are to some degree involved in it. It does make it a little harder because there's this whole process that takes place that we the people are involved in.
Right.
Yet we know it's still God's pulling
Right.
the strings.
Yeah, it doesn't eliminate these categories just because we've moved from monarchy to democracy, right? I mean, what things are still true under a monarchy or a democracy from Jesus' statements? What things are still that haven't changed because we moved from a monarchy to democracies, or if we were living under an authoritarian dictatorship, as some believers are today, right?
There's still a ladder of authority. Some people have more power, other people they delegate it down. So there's still everyone
Right.
answers to something.
Right, and Jesus is saying to Pilate, you think you hold me in your hands, you're actually being held in a bigger pair of hands, right? And you are going to be accountable for what you do, Pilate, with your power, right? A judgment day is coming for you, Pilate, right? And for every person who is given power, who takes power, is going to have to answer to the power eventually, right?
The leaders we have been put there by God.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if they were elected or they overthrew the last king. They're there because God wants them there.
Right, right. And again, in a democracy, that feels like it messes with our categories because the people put them there. But in a bigger sense, I think it's important to see the bigger sense of God's sovereignty of whether I live under a democracy. If I live under a democracy, I have to thank God that He sovereignly ordained that for me. If I live under an authoritarian dictatorship, I have to look to God and recognize I can't undo that, right? My hope is gonna have to be a longer horizon, right? Yeah, Newton.
I thought what Zeke said last week, well, I'm on my way to becoming a blubbering idiot, but when I finally get there, even then, I think I will remember what he said last week. And he said, I want to leave you with this, after saying that faith is the first step. I want to leave you with this. There is no second step. I thought that was a one-liner that grabbed me. And it applies to living under a government that I did not vote for, is that I have to continue doing the first step, and that is trusting God.
Yeah, Jesus placed himself under Pilate's, he allowed Pilate to crucify him, right? Because he knew that because his faith, he knew that wasn't the end of the story, right?
I've been reading the book of Hebrews now for 3.5 years, and he says, when Christ came into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but you have prepared a body for me. This is what Jesus took on. He took on the exalted second person of the Godhead, took on a body. Whole offerings and sin offerings you did not delight in. Then I said, here I am, as it is written of me in the scroll, I have come, O God, to do your will. He took on flesh. He became he left his exalted position to take on a body so that, and it is by the will of God that we have been consecrated, dedicated, grabbed, taken, marked out, taken, designated through the offering of the body, this body that he was given, through the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That was one of the verses. That was one of the concepts that made me realize for the first time, just a very few years ago, been a Christian since 1965, but it was that concept that God cares for me that much, that really grabbed me. And now I have been marked out with a special of continuing in that first step
Hmm.
to keep trusting Him.
Yeah. It's
I
the
think
good news, right?
was just spot on.
Hmm.
I want you to remember. Take it. There is no second step.
I thought when you said Hebrews, you're going to read from Hebrews 11.
I couldn't have
yeah.
done that then.
Yeah, where he talks about all of these Old Testament saints who experienced tremendous victory and deliverance, and then a whole list of who did not, right? Whose end, we say end, it's not really their end, right? Whose end of this chapter was to be sawn in half and torn in pieces, and along the model of what Jesus did, right? Because all of these in faith, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth, right? So I think this is the model which Jesus gives to us that is the normative Christian life, right? Is we should expect to die. I don't mean we should all expect to be martyrs, but there is going to be a death to self, whether that involves what Jesus went through or not, right? The basic expectation is that in this world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world, right? Those things are both true at the same time, right? We better keep moving with this passage. There's a lot still here. So political authority is a gift from God, even when it comes in the form of Pilate in Rome. And I would say anybody none of us have probably lived under full anarchy, but probably the only thing worse than tyranny is anarchy, and the tyranny of every single person being their own dictator, right? God intends, this is going to become more clear as the New Testament rolls on. God intends that the world be ordered under earthly governments. He doesn't delineate monarchy, democracy. It isn't finely laid out in those ways, and yet all of those forms of earthly government are ultimately accountable to God, right? None of them are truly autonomous. Every human ruler must answer for failures to govern in a way that aligns to God's ultimate truth, right? So he's saying to Pilate two things at the same time. I'm not here for a violent revolution. The government is a legitimate thing that's authorized by God, and yet there's very clear limits put around even people like Pilate, and when they do what they do, they are going to have to answer, right? So, picking up in verse 8 of John 19, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. This is interesting. He's supposed to be the most powerful guy in the room, right? From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." It's so ironic that the Jews are saying, you should be a better friend to Caesar, right? Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out. Why is this such an astonishing little paragraph?
One thing Pilate keeps repeating is, "I find no fault in him."
Yeah. Yeah. And Pilate's wife is like, you shouldn't kill this guy. He's a prophet, right? So what do we see even about, well, what do we see about Pilate in this situation?
Kind of really is powerless. Has to do what the mom tells him to do.
Yeah, he knuckles under to the mob, right? We see in Pilate, sometimes you get these sympathetic portrayals of Pilate. I don't think he comes off well in any sense of the word.
But would you really want to have your name in the Apostles' Creed? I mean, really
Yeah.
deserve that?
Yeah. A name that will live on. Yeah.
I mean, it's all about self-preservation.
It's totally self-preservation.
Politics even today.
Yeah.
It's so much about self-preservation. We had
Yeah.
multiple conversations this week with senators that said, I would have voted X, but the mob, the leadership said, if you do, we'll make sure you're not reelected.
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
very real.
Yeah.
Part of that. So they made a decision.
Right. Pilate's a camel who can't fit through the needle's eye with all the power and baggage that he's carrying, right? He would have to shed that. He's going to be held accountable, or he has been held accountable already, for how he acted in this moment. He could have, the right thing would have been to bow down and worship Jesus, right?
I see still a dilemma as this part of Pilate's battle. We can jump back up to the last part of chapter 18. Pilate declared, I see no fault in him.
Yeah.
And so actually it was a custom that caused the crucifixion, not by Pilate finding any fault in Christ.
Right.
So I thought that was a amazing thing, but if you see in the little details of that, it's a custom only at Passover.
Mm.
So the death of Christ could not have been any other time on the calendar.
Right.
It's a miracle in
Right.
itself.
It was the Passover.
The
Yeah.
time of it, that the custom wouldn't have been legal only at the time of Passover. That's amazing.
It's the whole thing is just mind-blowing the more you think about it, right? Jesus is the Passover, right?
Yes.
For our deliverance, yeah. So Pilate shows his own impotence in the face of the mob. He looks powerful, but he's actually a slave to the passions of the mob below him and Caesar above him. He's just a mid-level manager who does what he's told, right? And I think that's part of what you see his anger at times is like he's just dancing to the tune that they play. He dutifully bends over and does what's required, right? He's the consummate modern politician in the most cynical sense, right? Principles. He's just doing what he's told, whether that's from above or below, right?
I mean, that's, I'm sure that's why he's like, what is truth?
Right.
Suddenly he's like, tell me what this is.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's a very cynical, I don't think he's actually wanting to know truth. He's, what is truth? Like, it's all, he's very modern. He's very postmodern in the sense that postmodernity says everything is about power. There's no truth, there's just power, right? And Pilate believes that, right? So let's read that section again. This is from John 18. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. By the way, that Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. It's really hard to translate from Greek to English, but the commentators almost all agree that it is an affirmative. He's like, you said it, it's true, right? You say that I am a king. These are your words, not mine. But it's an affirmative way to say it. Yes, I am. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Does that feel like a weird detour, like Jesus was just talking about king and my kingdom, and then all of a sudden we veered off into a rabbit hole about truth. It took me a while to figure out what's going on here with this. What appears to be a veering off into speaking about truth when they were talking about power. Here's my best attempt at understanding that. Genuine authority comes from having a grasp on the truth. So we don't just let anyone set up shop and practice and perform surgeries, right, Chris? we want to assume that our surgeon has some grasp on the realities of the human body, right? So we give authority to do that, to conduct surgeries, to somebody who's been through a long session of training and learning the truth of how the human body works, right? But that's true for lots of things. We school teachers, they go through a process of training. Mike, journeyman, apprentice, right. They don't let just anybody do that. You have to go through this lengthy process of learning the truth of reality, right? Getting a grasp on reality. That's who we give authority to in a well-functioning society, is people who have a firm grasp on the truth, right? In a society that's not functioning well, we give power to people who don't have a good grasp on the truth. So somebody said, truth always gets to bat in the bottom of the ninth inning, right? Reality always gets to bat in the bottom of the ninth inning. It didn't feel like that happened with Jesus, but that's only if you look at the short term, right? That wasn't the ninth inning yet. Right? Pilate is like a modern or a postmodern cynic. He says all that matters is power. Mao said that truth comes from the barrel of a gun. That's a very cynical, it's a very cynical view of truth, right? Truth, whoever's right is whoever has the biggest gun, right? That's very much a postmodern worldview. But Jesus knows that truth actually holds far more genuine authority, has actually far more deep and lasting power. So I love this. I don't know if you guys have heard of a guy named Václav Havel. He was living under communist Czechoslovakia, and he was a dissident under communism. And he wrote an essay, I think he wrote it in the 1970s, so while communism was still in charge, and it was smuggled out of Czechoslovakia. And his most famous essay was called The Power of the Powerless. And the main image he uses in this essay is he asks us to imagine a shopkeeper, just a normal Joe shopkeeper living under that system. And he puts up a sign in his shop window that says, "Workers of the world unite." It's a slogan, right? Why does he put that up in his window? Because he wants to avoid trouble, right? Like they said Stalin, when Stalin would give a speech, the KGB would be watching to see who was the first person to stop clapping. Right? If you were the first person to stop clapping, you were politically in trouble, right? So people would go on clapping for half an hour, right? Because no one wanted to. So why does this shopkeeper put up this sign in his window? Does he believe it? No, he doesn't believe it. He's just trying to avoid trouble, right? And Václav Havel says this shopkeeper, he doesn't really believe it. He hides the humiliation of his coercion by telling himself, what's wrong with the workers of the world uniting, right? It's fear, and I'm drawing a connection with this shopkeeper and Pilate, right? Fear allows the official ideology to keep its grip on power. It eventually may change the shopkeeper's belief, where he actually comes to believe the propaganda that the state is telling him. People who do this live within a lie, Havel says, and they partner with the corrupt system and they compromise their integrity by going along with the lie. He says every act that challenges the official ideology threatens that corrupt system. Right? If the shopkeeper stops placing the sign in his window and refuses to knuckle under, he will be living in accord with the truth, but it will cost him dearly. He may lose his job. His kids may not be able to go to college. Acquaintances, I wouldn't say friends, but acquaintances may avoid him. By speaking the truth, or at least not speaking a lie, he's done something potentially powerful. He said that the emperor has no clothes. He said this out loud to the world. Everyone can now see that it is indeed possible to stop living a lie. Because his actions are public, they're unavoidably political. He shows the strength of his views by a willingness to suffer for them. He is now a threat to the system, and the system will punish him, right? He has kept his integrity. This political act and the integrity of a critical mass of people with this same kind of political courage is far more important than an election. There's a lot going on there. Does that make sense? So the shopkeeper who stops putting the sign on the window, he's not a powerful man, but he has real power just by standing on the side of truth and reality. And that act from a single brave person threatens the whole system, which is why the system has to target him, because he becomes a threat. Just by standing with truth, he becomes a threat against the system. And in a sense, this is, in a more profound way, this is what Jesus does, right? He offers himself. He is crucified under the system, but by standing with integrity, with truth, he brings the system down, even as he's killed by it. Does that make sense?
Not comfortable.
No, and again, faith. This is where faith. Because if you don't believe it, then I'm going to keep putting that sign up in my window. If I don't believe ultimately that God is going to have the last word, that the ninth inning is God, then I'll probably just keep putting that sign in my window and knuckling under. Right. And so we know how this chapter ends, or this episode ends. Pilate crucifies Jesus. He puts a sign over his head that says "King of the Jews." And what do the religious leaders say? They get mad. You should write on there, he says he's the King of the Jews, right? And Pilate says, I've written what I've written. I think he puts this sign over there to mock them. He certainly doesn't act like he believes Jesus is king, right? Because he's killing him. I think that sign is initially there to mock, oh, here's your king, we just crucified him. And the Jews don't like it because they know they're being mocked. And they think it's not theologically correct, even though it is. So it's a profoundly ironic and profoundly true that Jesus, in his moment of crucifixion, is defeating for all time the powers of sin and death and hell. This is what brings them down, is his sacrifice on the cross, right? Judo is a martial arts where I've never done this, but that you're using your opponent's attack on you, his assault, and you're using the momentum of his attack to flip him over onto his back, right? That's ultimately, that's the cross. The Satan thought he was winning, and ultimately he thought his greatest victory turned into his ultimate defeat, right? And what looked like to everyone Jesus' ultimate defeat was actually his coronation, right? His ultimate victory.
That seems what's so amazing. He took the scriptures and he knew
Right.
this is the playbook, and yet I'm guess so power hungry.
Yeah.
Let's go with it.
Yeah.
But Satan
Yeah.
knew it.
Yeah.
Still, you would have thought he was doing everything he could to stop this.
Right.
Don't
Right.
crucify him.
Right. Yeah. Paul calls this the mystery that was revealed. Christ's. None of the people who love the Old Testament, I don't think, as much as they loved it, they still, and I don't think any of us would have been any better, could envision what actually happened, right? This is the mystery that was revealed with the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? Yeah, if you think in the control room of hell, a bunch of people got fired that day. I don't know.
Well, a few weeks ago, once you asked the question, did Satan know what the outcome of this was going to be? And at one point, I think you suggested maybe he didn't.
Yeah, surely he would have. I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that he saw it turning out the way that it turned out.
But as he said, maybe he was just so hungry for power.
Yeah. I mean, he somehow knew Jesus was the one, right? And I'm sure through all of his powers, like when Jesus, 30-some years on earth, Satan, I'm sure he had Satan's full attention during that time. These are speculative things, but surely that was the thing that Satan was focused on the most, right? And yet, Jesus won, right?
Well, he's still active today, knowing that.
Right,
We're gonna win as well.
right.
Still on that same
Yeah,
path of collecting as many people
yeah,
to his side as he can.
yeah,
Still knowing the outcome.
yeah. Any final thoughts?
Is it possible that John, when he's writing in chapter 19, is referring back, when he talks about truth, to the call of Nathaniel, when he sees Nathaniel, one of the disciples, and he tells him what he saw in his vision, and then Nathaniel responds, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel, like that being the truth, that Jesus was the King, and
Right.
Jesus was the Son of God.
Right.
Like that is paramount to truth.
Yeah.
Jesus was who he claimed to be.
Right. No, that's all true. Also, yeah, for sure.
And yet, this, I think Scott Johnson taught on this, the reality of when Jesus, like who killed Jesus? And it's not one person who killed Jesus.
Right.
Pilate,
We all killed Jesus ultimately.
Pilate killed Jesus. The
Right.
Jewish leaders killed Jesus. The mob killed Jesus.
Right.
The nation of Israel did. The Romans killed Jesus, and we each
My
killed
sin,
Jesus,
yeah,
and
right.
My sin did. And at the same time, Jesus gave up his life. He gave it up.
Right.
And so
He
it's
laid
not
it
a
down.
simple-
No one took it. No one takes it from me. I lay it down. Right.
Yeah, and that's what's the power.
Right.
The power of the gospel is
Right.
if Jesus hadn't died,
Right.
we would all be slaves to sin,
Right.
sitting under judgment.
Right. And I think ultimately you could say no one really knew what was going on except God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, right? And so John, we're going to look, I think in maybe 2 weeks. John is the same guy who wrote the book of Revelation. which is a very political book. We'll try to spend one whole week on the politics of Revelation. Which is a very different chapter in the story than this one, right? But it's the same reality, the same king. Yeah.
Psalm 2 is a very succinct description of God's control over.
Yeah. Why do the nations rage,
Yeah.
right?
I knew a guy, his son, a 5-year-old son, is exhausted. Well, I need a drink of water before I go to bed. So he says to his dad, "Why did the heathen rage?"
How much time do you have, son?
Anyway, but it talks about how God the kings of the earth make their plans against God, against his anointed, and God just laughs.
Yeah.
He's derisive towards their best efforts.
Yeah.
They have nothing on him.
Yeah.
And they aren't just under his authority, but they're feckless.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot do anything that he doesn't specifically allow.
Yeah.
So they're under his control,
Right.
not just under his authority.
Right.
So
Pilate was 4 years into his term of, there weren't term limits. He was 4 years into his governorship at the crucifixion of Jesus, and he only lasted another 7 years, and then he fell out of favor with Caesar, and he was out on his ear. But, so we're out of time. So, oh yes, the seniors. Noon, would you close us in prayer?